This episode is dedicated to Jeremy Jusu, Kobe Picker, Mai Seppo, and Brandon Hauer, for becoming our newest Southpaw supporters, and helping to make this project possible.
The Southpaw Project is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you want to support the work that we do, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Share these episodes, follow us on social media. If you're a new listener, make sure to click subscribe. And if you really want to support this project, then become a paid monthly subscriber on patreon.com/southpawpod. If you head over to Patreon and subscribe for just $4 a month, you will get immediate access to our complete catalog of bonus episodes, videos, and articles. The more supporters we have, the more time we can dedicate to the show, which means more bonuses. And most important of all, hire and pay for staff. If you can't support us monthly, you can also do one-time donations at ko-fi.com/southpawpod. We also have t-shirts and sweatshirts to not only flex the show, but your own moral compass. By supporting us, you're not only helping us grow, you're also helping us stay and keep this project running. We can't exist without your support. Thank you.
Yeah. We can just do a thing where if we run out of, if we like hit a bump in the conversation where it's like, so what are we talking about? I can just read a poem if you want. I've got this poetry book in front of me.
If you read a poem, we might not put it on the episode, but it might be a Patreon exclusive.
There we go.
Get to hear some poetry.
Okay. So this one is called For Adorable Adrian Adonis, Unable to Wash the Pink from His Hands. Hey AD, which way's the wind blowing today, brother? Have you taken a walk on the wild side in a while? Hulk Hogan, 1986.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pride Never Die. It is your girl, Parian, and I'm very sorry for being gone for so long. It's been about 3 weeks of incredibly heavy ruckus of construction right outside my bedroom where I record, and I figured no one would want to hear a bunch of concrete saws and men hollering in the background of the podcast. So, we're back now. And I'm joined today by AJ.
Hello, I'm AJ. I use they or she pronouns.
All right, and we're here to talk about combat sports and pro wrestling and how those two things are kind of the same thing, but in different ways, and the ways in which queerness and performance and stuff kind of come out more in pro wrestling and can still exist within combat sports. So to start off, why don't you give some of our listeners a little bit of your background? I know you have your own podcast and stuff too about pro wrestling. If you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I have a show called 2x2. It's called that because I went to Catholic school and I can't avoid a shitty Catholic Bible pun. Because it's a show where we mostly cover pro wrestling Noah in Japan. And yeah, so we basically just, that was a company me and my friend Envy were both interested in but never really gave any time to, and we said, why don't we just start a show where we get to know it? And then of course we instantly fell in love with it. The show is, we have some unannounced plans to maybe expand it, but at the moment it's about this one particular company. Though we have done the odd episode about prison abolition or using our friends' role-playing game to fantasy book some stuff, whatever.
All fun things.
I guess just more background for me in terms of pro wrestling and martial arts. I have never really done much of either. I went to one kickboxing class when I was 9, and whether he was just a savvy salesman or I truly had something, the instructor used me as an example twice. So I was very proud and really wanted to get involved in kickboxing. But the £4 per session was just too much for us at that point, so I couldn't afford to go. I got into boxing at one point because me cousin's boyfriend was like a boxer and he'd offered to train me, and I got really excited by the idea of training. But then, when it's like families, partners, shit doesn't work out all the time, so that didn't end up happening. Yeah, and all through this, like as I was a kid, I was a pro wrestling fan. Never really got to see it on telly much, just because it was hard to see. Like it was hard to catch. You needed to have the right channels. You needed to know when it was on. And like, so I mostly kept up with wrestling through the video games. And I eventually came back to it as an adult. A few years ago with like Wrestle Kingdom 12, I started to get into New Japan Pro Wrestling. And then like from there, I eventually found out about, like the British and United States independent scenes. And yeah, it's just kind of grown from there. And I used to, even though like I talked about like wanting to get involved in kickboxing as a kid and like enjoying boxing and stuff like that, I never liked MMA because it was always just too gruesome for me. Like it turned my stomach when I saw someone like going for like, who'd got the knockout and was still going in for the kill sort of thing. I was like, oh no, something about this, like it doesn't scratch the same itch. You know what I mean? Like it felt like I was watching an assault rather than a fight. But then, since then I've fallen in love with like shoot style pro wrestling and the Ukai style. I don't know whether you pronounce it Ukai or Yukai. I've only ever seen it written down, but that's like, what came out of UWFI and then Pancrase, etc. All those different companies from that lineage, or from, I say lineage not to emphasize that, but it's just that when you look into it, a lot of those companies who wrestled those styles actually were like directly descended from the UWFI in terms of like either the roster or who the trainers were, one thing or another.
That's actually something I want to go back to a little bit with Pancrase, because I think that's something that some of the listeners that might not be a little bit more familiar with pro wrestling and how long it's been going on and its connection to shoot style fights might be wondering, because they've probably heard of the company Pancrase as an MMA promotion. So if you could go on with some of the history of how those two are kind of connected, that would be great.
So like Pancrase and, other, I think rings people might have heard of as like being MMA promotions were basically just pro wrestling, except, like as most people understand pro wrestling, it's fixed, except, depending on who you speak to behind the scenes, it's always a mix of like, well, there were fixes, obviously, but also, most of the time we just went in there and just had some fun with it and just, had a match. And it's like that sort of card, where, like the way of structuring the card, where like some of the matches have been fixed and some of them haven't. If anything, that is like more of like the tradition of what pro wrestling truly is, rather than it being like just one or the other. Like it's always sort of been that mix. And you could say the same for basically any other sport.
Yeah.
There's always been a mix of fixes and shits. And it also, I think when you think about what it means to be a professional wrestler, as like someone who's navigating this scene where maybe you'll be asked to have a shoot fight and maybe you'll be asked to work a match with like a specific ending or that tells a specific story or whatever. Like, I think navigating that side of things and like the fluidity between what you and your opponent might be doing, and like, whether or not the fight is realistic, you're both still professional fighters. Your goal is not going to be to injure the other person. Your goal is still going to be to put on the best show, even if like you really want to win. So Pancrase and Ring, they are all part of that, what I was just calling then like Ukai, like the sort of UWFI family. So UWFI originally came out of New Japan Pro Wrestling in the mid 80s. I think 86. I'm not great for dates, but maybe 85. But yeah, anyway, it was originally being designed for Anthony Inoki, who, gets talked about more in pro wrestling than in MMA, but is sometimes pointed to back for, the big exhibition match between him and Muhammad Ali, and like the special rule set that they came up to like facilitate that fight, which led to like a very, very boring match for spectators, which was also very personally physically damaging for Ali, like basically the worst thing for like what you want least as a promoter, like fucks up your athletes and like the crowd hated it.
Yeah, no one has a good time, and then your pro boxer has a mangled leg.
Yeah, so there's a big style divide in Japanese pro wrestling that didn't necessarily exist in like American or British wrestling, which was the what was called the King's Road style, which was mostly what operated in all Japan, and there was the strong style, which is like what Inoki developed. And so they were both Inoki. Giant Baba was the one who ran all Japan, and Inoki was the one who ran New Japan, and they were both students of like Riki Dozan, who was a Korean Japanese wrestler, who was like basically the biggest wrestler in Japan. He was like one of the first big stars of like the post-war boom. So like they were both his like apprentices, and like went in different directions with how they wanted to do their wrestling. And Inoki's approach was essentially, I want pro wrestling to be seen as a martial art. I want it to be seen as the martial art, like the best fighting style, which is like why he would try and set up fights like he did against Muhammad Ali, because he like wanted to prove that pro wrestling was legit, like that, this shit isn't fake, like regardless of whether it's fixed, it's not fake. I can fuck you up and I will do it. And so then it was so that was like sort of his whole ethos and what he was known for. He's also a right-wing politician whose politics have shifted through the years, but I think last I heard was a member of Abe's party. So, no, he was literally like a kind of fascist politician. But so that's another thing you can't really escape with martial arts and pro wrestling, is the people who seem to be in the positions of power to like help develop these, who can help guide where these go, often tend to skew right wing.
Yeah.
There was like some sort of corporate coup in New Japan in the mid 80s where Inoki was like dethroned, like he was no longer running the show. So other people in New Japan, other wrestlers, created the UWFI, like with the intention of setting it up as like the new promotion for Inoki to be the big star of. But he basically was like, no, it's cool, I'm going to stay with New Japan. And they were like, oh, well, we've got this all figured out now. We might as well just do it without him. And so this goes through like, it originally starts as like more of a traditional pro wrestling organization. Like I've watched the first show, and the opening match is like a lucha tag team match, which like the first spot is a fireball spot. So, like, not at all what you would call like a more sports style presented product or whatever. But eventually it was the real martial arts influenced matches that became like the house style, and then that was what they were known for. And this was under Satori Sayama, the first ever Tiger Mask. He was one of the people there. He would go on to after leaving UWFI after like a year, he would form his own promotion called Shuto, which was basically shoot wrestling. So it was like pro wrestling rules, but it was a shoot contest. So, basically MMA. And at the same time, I think not long after UWFI folded and a lot of the people returned back to New Japan, but then there was a second UWFI that they called UWFI Reborn, and they had their own match rules, which were very similar to, what people might recognize from Pancrase, where it's like you have 5 points, you lose a point if you take a rope break, or if you get knocked down. So you lose the match by losing all your points, being knocked out, or by submitting, but there's no pinfalls. So like obviously, when there's no pinfalls and you can work from the ground and you're not having to worry about just being forced down and losing the match that way, the style of fight and the style of story that is being told is a lot similar to one in MMA. It's using a lot of the same language, so to speak, regardless of whether it's rehearsed.
Mm-hmm.
Or whether it's not rehearsed, but both people know what the last thing they're going to say together is. And so from there, it's out of these different promotions that we get like Maeda eventually forms Rings. He was another one who was like in New Japan and then went through UWF. His students Suzuki and Funaki, and a third one whose name I can never remember off the top of my head. I'm sorry. Form Pancrase. And there's loads of organizations that shoot up at the time. It's like very popular, and the line between was this match worked or was it like a shoot is like kind of non-existent. But then it's also like there's a very famous instance of the first ever King of Pancrase title match, I think, between Bas Rutten and Masakatsu Funaki. Rutten thought it was a shoot. Funaki knew he was putting Rutten over. So it's basically, if you watch the match, it's just Funaki like doing his best to fend Rutten off and like be in the fight and like put on a good show, whereas Rutten is going for the kill the whole time. Like it's a good match, but like it's also it's a very similar vibe to Pride, which Pancrase is often cited as being like the source of inspiration for Pride, but it was more of a scene that was going than that, I think. But yeah, it's one of those. It's very much like Pride, where it's like even if you look into Pride, which is generally accepted as being an MMA promotion as well, a lot of those fights were worked sometimes. But we don't necessarily know which ones were and which ones weren't, and so even in that space, which is now accepted as this is MMA, like the same way that to some people Rings and Pancrase are, it's like, well, okay, but how much of it is what most people would consider MMA versus pro wrestling? And there's not really a clear answer.
Yeah, and that's definitely something I think about a lot with how a lot of MMA fans in America definitely know of Kazushi Sakuraba, but they're told to think of him more as like someone who is trained as a catch wrestler, because Americans have this aversion to thinking of pro wrestling as like a martial art and in tandem with MMA in such a weird way. But the Kazushi Sakuraba was a pro wrestler.
Yeah, that's another thing. It's like when you talk about catch wrestling, this was something I wasn't necessarily primed to notice until I joined the Southpaw Discord and had certain discussions or saw certain discussions with Sam, who like knows a lot about which shoot or pro wrestlers or whatever were like trained by who and stuff like that, and knows more of the behind the scenes thing rather than just like a general shape of what the scene was like. And I've noticed that basically people use catch wrestling to mean shoot pro wrestling. But really, it's just that there is pro wrestling and there is shoot pro wrestling, or there is worked pro wrestling. Like catch pro, like people, I've heard people say that like catch is the true catch wrestling, as if to say that pro wrestling is the pretend catch wrestling. Right. It's like no, catch wrestling is pro wrestling, which is both the fake stuff and the real stuff. So since being like sort of primed by these discussions in the Discord and stuff like that, I've noticed a lot more how people tend to use catch wrestling as well, as well as to distance themselves from this perception of fakeness.
Right.
It also is to give themselves a sense of lineage and a sense like that they can, treat as being just as important as like whatever martial arts lineage someone might be invested in. And also so that they can claim certain things as being part of their own tradition. And it's almost like a way of saying, instead of noticing the overlap or the synthesis between different styles, it's a way of saying, no, we don't get that from them. Or this didn't develop by coming into conflict with this other thing or whatever. No, this came from our guys. Actually, they made it. They were like mostly white dudes and they did it for us. It's just a coincidence that they were mostly white dudes. But yeah, they were all mostly white dudes. Stop noticing that they were all white dudes. We also like some of the Japanese dudes that those white dudes trained, because those white dudes trained them. And we won't mention that all of those Japanese dudes were also previously trained by other Japanese people.
Right. Yeah, we'll just kind of like whitewash all of their origins by claiming that Ketch is where they got everything, and then it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I've even heard people make the case of, like, I'm not going to call anyone out because I'm not trying to start podcast beef or anything like that. But I listen to like a wrestling history podcast, so I listen to several of these, and one of them, would refer to, would say that like a lot of things that you might think come from judo or jujitsu, like arm bars and stuff like that. No, this actually already existed in the catch tradition, which is like, not wrong necessarily, but like, and he used that to make the point of like, because, we're all working with roughly the same thing, the human body. We have the same set of biomechanics that we're dealing with, that we can figure shit out. Like we can figure out what holds to apply, where leverage needs to be pushed, that sort of thing. But then he without skipping a breath, would go on to like imply that a bunch of these things that we might think came from other martial arts traditions actually came from catch. It was like, it works one way but not the other. Like we can use catch, we can use the truth of the matter to say, we didn't get it from you, we got it from our guys, but it can never be the other way around. Like,
right, yeah, it's always the thing of, well, we invented it, but obviously.
Yeah, it's like a weird, sort of retrospective intellectual colonialism. It's really weird. Not that this doesn't happen in other areas. It's just a strange thing to now be able to see actively, like oh no, people are like just telling fucking stories about this. Like people have just convinced themselves that this is how it actually is.
Yeah, they've just kind of told themselves a way to make it fit in with their worldview in some way, and then that's all they hold on to.
Yeah.
Something else I was really interested to get to talk about with pro wrestling is a thing I've noticed myself as someone who's a fan of pro wrestling and of MMA and other martial arts, is that I tend to see more open progressivism and like just kind of queer allyship and people of color being more welcome in pro wrestling, like fan spaces. And something that I got thinking about is that I've had a lot of people come to me about me enjoying MMA, and they've asked how I can enjoy it when it is so violent, almost like you were mentioning earlier, where sometimes the finishes look almost more like an assault. And I think something that helps get more people that have that progressive mindset into pro wrestling is knowing that both of the competitors are trying to avoid injury as much as possible. I think that makes people feel a little bit comfortable. And I also think it's somewhat of the fact that the performance aspect is embraced more.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like, it's like watching a magician. It's like, you're being tricked. You're trying to, but it's like, can the magician sweep you up in the performance while you're trying to figure out how he's tricking you? Like, I think people are more comfortable with, I at least definitely was more comfortable with performed violence when I could, rationalize it as just being like, well, it's fake, really, isn't it? And you go through, like, getting into pro wrestling from a little kid to an adult, you go through various stages of this is fake versus this is not fake at all, actually. Like, you know, and the ways that both of those things are true. And I think pro wrestling is just like a really interesting way to like think dialectically. And I know that like that's a really, you know, pompous thing to say. But, you know, again, I'll go back to like Sam has been tweeting recently of like how a lot of politics becomes much easier to discuss if you have a pro wrestling vocabulary. And it's because like a lot of the pro wrestling vernacular is like built up around this acknowledgement of we are lying to you.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, like we never acknowledge that politicians are lying to us in a way that we won't also accept platitudes from another politician about. You know what I
Right,
mean?
yeah.
Like we're in pro wrestling, we know we can't trust anyone. Like we know we can't trust anyone, and we just need to find the people we want to cheer on anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's interesting. Like, people kind of already do this with politics, as we've kind of implied there, where like you just kind of accept the lie from whoever is your face that you're trying to root for, and it doesn't matter if they're lying because you're in their corner.
Yeah, or like you'll support them because you appreciate the way that they will gesture at it being a lie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little tongue in cheek makes it more supportive.
Republicans are just smart marks, is what I'm saying.
The Smark Party.
Oh no. Yeah, okay.
Have to reconsider a lot now.
I'm just saying, there's a lot of overlap between like pro wrestling fans and DSA as well, I think. Like, you know, but also this is something about populist politics and pro wrestling just goes hand in hand.
It's always making me think of just Dusty Rhodes promos every time.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, as well as our private chat group on Discord. But more importantly, it'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
But yeah, no, I think you were saying you got asked about like people saying like, oh, how do you watch it with like the levels of violence and stuff?
I was talking about like just people come to me about MMA and stuff, and about the levels of violence and about how extreme it seems, and that kind of gives them a pause trying to become a fan. And I think that's why I see more progressive fan like spots in pro wrestling, is because people are able to separate that violence that's still happening. It's still real. People are still getting concussed and beat up, but because it has a thing where the competitors are working together and they're not intending to harm one another,
it's more explicitly cooperative.
Yeah, I think that's a lot more palatable for people that have more progressive views, at least at first. I know some people have been able to come around to MMA eventually.
Yeah, I'm one of them. I'm a new convert. Like over the past year or so, I've been slowly getting into it from this, falling in love with shoot style pro wrestling, old and new, because it's sort of having a resurgence right now. Currently, in Japan, there's Great, which is a promotion launched by Ledette, who used to own Noah, but like they sold Noah to DDT, and then we're like, oh well, now we've got all these people who know how to run a wrestling company. I guess we should still have a wrestling company, and they've like revived the UWF like again recently.
Some more.
Yeah. And in the US at the moment, like all sorts of shoot style is happening on the indies. And like early in the pandemic, it definitely had reached mainstream TV as well, because they were doing, Bloodsport, Josh Barnett's Bloodsport, which he was, which he was given. His name was put on it after alleged rapist Matt Riddle's name was taken off of it because he signed to WWE. Yeah, so pro wrestling is still very much like a lot of the things that would give you pause about MMA are just as rampant in pro wrestling. But there's also a lot of the shoot style that's happening now is happening in like a company called Paradigm, which is like features a lot of queer people, a lot of people of color. They do a lot of interesting experiments. They recently did have one of the owners did a gender reveal match for which was, I didn't watch it. Maybe it didn't even happen. I complained about it on the internet and people got, I was upset about it. I think some other people were upset about it.
I'm sure.
But like generally speaking, they're like what it was that in particular felt like a kick in the teeth because they're one of my favorite companies on the indies. But there's also Camp Leapfrog did Frog Sport, which was like their own take on Bloodsport, which so like it was shoot style, but they were willing to get silly with it sometimes, but still really really good matches. And also recently, a new promotion started called Combat Fights Unlimited, which you and I watched their first show together, Shoot to Thrill, which is like all women shoot style in a cage with no ring ropes.
Yeah, and that was really fun. It was it's fun to see the way that you can put together finishes in a shoot style that gives you a lot more variety and things to work with as compared to like the pinfall style of wrestling.
Yeah, and so like there's a lot happening right now, which is like, part of why it's like pro wrestling is still really exciting to me, even though like, the scales have been removed from my eyes a little bit. And, like even post speaking out, a lot of things haven't been addressed. A lot of people are happy to act like they've addressed things that they haven't, you know what I mean? Like from big companies to small. So it's like not easy to be a pro wrestling fan, but also, I'm going to be fucking training soon because I'm one of these freaks who loves it and I want to be involved. So like, maybe I'm immediately just like, I can't just think of like, oh, I'm going to get to train wrestling. That's cool. Because I've got my fucked up brain, I've got to think like, oh, I get to train pro wrestling, that thing I love, cool. Okay, so also now I need to think about how could I set up a wrestling co-op promotion. How could I bring back Flying Falls because I think that'll be cool. How can I get like shoot style popping in the UK because like there's the odd hybrid rules match here and there. A new promotion is partnered with ROH, so they're doing pure rules match. That's Wrestle Carnival. But like, generally speaking, there hasn't been wrestling in the UK over the past 18 months. Like that's a thing that's only just starting again. And it's, so like I don't just want to get involved. I want to like, I want to help shape things a little bit. I want to do the thing which I think has helped like queer wrestling thrive in the US scene specifically, which is like I want to learn what I need to learn, and then as well as whatever else I'm doing, I want to carve out my own shit. You know what I mean? Like I want to make sure I think there are like several promotions already in the UK that are like explicitly queer promotions. It's just that we don't really have big promotions in the UK anymore. Like that we were having like an indie boom. And WWE basically just came and bought everyone up. And, like the biggest promotion in the UK is probably Progress, which is like basically just owned by the WWE now. like
it's kind of like a feeder.
Yeah. And yeah, you can say that about like a lot of the formerly like big names are like, well, now they're just owned by the WWE, and like there's still lots of small places doing their own thing, and there's lots of like a lot of places that are doing interesting experimental stuff. Like I think Wrestling Resurgence is like specifically going for like hybridizing pro wrestling with theater performance and stuff like that, and performing arts in general. Riptide Pro Wrestling down in Brighton has like been very specifically, like queer led and focused since its inception. But even a lot of these like cool places that I'm naming, it's like if you go back and watch this stuff from 2 years ago, you're probably going to be watching stuff with someone who's since been outed as like an abuser in one respect or another, like. And that's something like both as a fan and as someone who wants to get involved with the industry is like very difficult to contend with. But I think probably the reason I didn't like give up on pro wrestling, besides just like, well, I fucking love it, like how can I, is like one of I saw a wrestler tweet like not long after like Speaking Out was like really kicking off, like, hey, I get why this is too much for people. I get why this might happen and it causes you to say like, no, I can't be involved in wrestling anymore. But like at the same time, think about all these like brave people, for the most part women, but people who are like speaking up about this shit they've had to face through and they've had to face, and like they haven't quit wrestling. Like, this is supposed to be the time that we get rid of the abusers. Like, are you just gonna leave us to like not be able to thrive after they're gone? Are you gonna make it so that they had to live with that for nothing? You know what I mean? Like that sort of thing. And it's like, like any medium, you can't blame the medium, but you have to acknowledge like, okay, but what are the structures in place that allowed this to happen or that encouraged this to happen? And some of that is like in the UK, at least, some of that may be coming in the form of government oversight, which, who knows how that will turn out. Like, I think there was like a special group made in Parliament for like looking into wrestling. I think there was a decision made recently where it was like now in the UK, wrestling will legally be treated as a sport in training, but as art in performance. So like a show will be treated as like an arts show, but like training schools are treated as sports training, which I think is like probably the most like accurate way you could distill it down. Really, is like, no, when we're training together, that is like the closest it is to a sport. Like, we would be doing basically all the same training if this was a real fight, except because you still need to learn how to fall so that a back body drop doesn't break your neck. You know what I mean? Like, regardless of whether, a lot of like pro wrestling moves that were popularized when pro wrestling first started becoming like a thing back in like the Lancashire Catch days was like a lot of amateur fights would happen with like just between two people who would fight under pro wrestling rules, and because they weren't pros, usually someone would end up dead or crippled by it. Like they'd end up with a broken neck or broken ribs or like a punctured lung, and like a lot of people died that way. But like, that's not a deadly move if you're actually a trained professional, because you know how to take it, and that's regardless of whether it was a shoot or a work. Like, you still didn't throw someone trying to injure them. You threw them to try and get the fall, which was like that. This was before pinfalls as well. So like we had flying falls where it was like you want the other person's shoulders to hit the ground at the same time. You don't need to hold them down. So you could throw someone and you want them to land safely, because like if they land on their shoulders, you win. So like you don't want them to land on the neck or the head or anything else. Like you want the person to land safely. And I think like that's part of why I have like this pie in the sky idea of bringing flying falls back into modern pro wrestling, is because like I like all the different ways that affects the match and like all the different storytelling angles that like, presents. But at the same time, it's also just like, it's something different. You know what I mean? Like a lot of things. There's a lot of shit going on in pro wrestling, whether it's MMA or whether it's fake shit, whether it's bullshit. But you've always got there are less limitations in the work stuff and in because like you can just do whatever. You can just have fun with it more. You don't and it's I want to have some fun.
What we were talking about earlier with you talking about how there were people tweeting out, like, you know, the people talking out about this are brave people that you should support and stay in wrestling and things, also made me think about just more reasons why I might see more progressivism in the fan base. Is I think with pro wrestling, it's easier to find a wrestler or wrestlers that you do agree with politically and like personally on what they stand for. And it's easier to get behind them like as a real person. It's easier to find their social media and connect with them and see how they actually are as a person. Whereas in MMA, still, a lot of the fighters, if you might become connected to them by watching their fights and feeling like you're a big fan of them, and then come to find out that, oh, this person's like just a fascist or really racist or whatever, and then you have to constantly deal with that kind of being burned aspect of like, well, I can't be a fan of anyone because I don't know who to trust.
See, this just sounds like pro wrestling to me.
Right, yeah.
See, that's still that's still the case in pro wrestling. Even when there's a lot of out, you know, like queer performers and, you know, like people who specifically champion themselves as like left wing or whatever. Like the most famous case is David Starr, who I don't know how much about him you know or you are aware of, but it was basically the speaking out against him, which like kicked off the speaking out movement. And before that, he was literally like the champion of the unionization movement. And he was like the big left-wing guy who was always speaking out against racism and against homophobia and against transphobia and against misogyny. And, you know, it came out that like he just didn't live up to any of that in his private life, like any of it.
Yeah. And that's also something that when that kind of came out, it just reminded me of a lot of things that had come out about cis male like voices on the left in general, because that's been a thing that's gone on in several places where, you know.
Yeah, I mean, if like a joke that was like very, you know, like grimly but appropriately made after he was outed was like, oh, you know, there goes David Starr, like completing the DSA bro gimmick, getting outed as an abuser.
Right.
Like,
yeah, it's not wrong.
And I think, like, I've heard people say that, like, before he got outed, he had been planning to retire from wrestling to go into politics.
Yeah, really shows you the connection there.
I mean, that's another story. There's a lot of connections between politics and wrestling, like beyond the meta level, but like literally like people who were both, you know.
Absolutely. One of the things that kind of got me more into learning more about boxing history and things like that is finding out the links between like organized crime, politicians, and boxers, and like how all of that kind of blends together in these weird ways. And
yeah, again, like that was, you know, also has links in like how pro wrestling became a work is like, you know, depending on what town you went to fight in, you might have to like face a different crime family that says that they want you to take a fall or you know, or whatever, and you would have to either do what they say or figure out a way to not do what they say and not die.
yeah,
Like,
which is not the easiest thing.
yeah, but you know, like the most people would always, you know, they'd figure out a way. It's workers are workers, and they always will be.
I can't take the work out of the wrestler.
Take the wrestler out of the work, but you can't take the work out of the wrestler.
Perfect. That's my new bumper sticker I'm printing.
God, it's so funny to do like insider humor bumper stickers for wrestling, like, you know, kayfabe breaking bumper stickers, where it's like, you know, people are just keep it in a drawer at home, like, oh, if only I could put you on my car, but you know, I know how funny you are, I know how much you show my personality off.
Right. And it's for no one else. Speaking of kayfabe, I think like that's honestly kind of one of the things that I think is the best term to use when talking about like MMA promotions and their hesitancy to admit that they kind of are just pro wrestling. Is like they want to keep this kayfabe thing of like, we have no connection to that. It's a completely different thing. There's definitely never been a worked MMA fight. wink, wink. Like, yeah.
Oh, certainly not. And you know, again, this goes back to like the same thing that Sam always says of like, regardless of whether or not there has actually been like a fixed fight, the conditions for fixing exist, and there are ways that things can be fixed without quite being fixed. Like, you know, like the same as in Pancrase, as like Boss didn't know he was winning, but Funaki knew he was losing. Like, just like the same way where it's like they can manipulate that to get the outcome they want, which is like Bass fighting as if he needs to give everything just to survive, just to win this fight, which is what he did and what they wanted. Whereas Funaki's goal is to like keep it going. In that, like, just as they were able to manipulate things in that way, they can manipulate tournament brackets. They can manipulate who are we actually going to crack down on for the PED pops. You know, like who, you know, who's going to get access to these trainers or to these promotional you know, material, like who are we going to put on our show, who are we going to put on our posters, who, you know, whatever. Like, all of this is, at the end of the day, like, MMA fighters get pushes the same way that wrestlers do. At the end of the day, they are still booked. It is still a promotional industry, and as long as it is a promotional industry, it will be pro wrestling. There was this promo given by Minoru Suzuki in like a car park in South England when he came over here for a Rev Pro show or for a New Japan show, I don't remember which. And it was basically just him being like, pro wrestling doesn't stand for professional wrestling, it stands for promotional wrestling. It's about what you can sell to people. And like, at the end of the day, MMA is the same game. It's about what are we selling, and ultimately what they tend to be selling is, you know, who's Dana's favorite boy against like, you know, either the person he wishes they could be or someone he knows they can beat. Like, it's always going to be one of the two. And you know, it's not always going to be his favorite, and what he wants out of them isn't always going to be the same thing, but it gets booked. Someone decides who these people are fighting and why. Like, we don't have to be told the why, but there is a why behind every decision.
Mm-hmm. And that's something you'll see, like, being a more seasoned fan, is you can kind of pick up on those whys and hows. And like, I think the most recent example that's probably pretty clear is it's something that people wouldn't usually think of as like a traditional fix. But Sean O'Malley versus Chris Samantino, I mean, they picked a guy from regional MMA to come in and fight their darling because they wanted him to win, obviously. Like, it's not, you know, there's no guaranteed outcome, and Chris could have definitely pulled out a win if he managed to get the opportunity, but they were planning on Sean winning for sure.
You don't need to fix it to fix it. And
right.
That's why, like, a lot of the reasons, like, the old pro wrestling champions used to also be shooters, because like promoters felt like it's not enough to have a champion that you trust not to turn on you. You need to have a champion you can trust to not be turned on, like in the ring by the opponent who wants to go against the plans to steal the championship for himself. Because, like, you know, back in the day, it was like if someone just fucking shot on the other guy and got the pin, well, then they would have to do it. Like, it's in the ring, everyone sees it happening, you know. Like, at that point, it doesn't matter whether it was fixed. The other person can put themselves in the position where they can take the championship. What happens when they've got the championship? Well, they have the promoter in the palm of their hand. Then they say what fucking goes, because they're the one with the belt. Unless the promoter decides he doesn't want to play ball and strips them of the title, like we recently saw with Ngannou. And like, that's another thing where it's like fixing it without fixing it. He just fucking took the belt off him because he wouldn't play ball. Like, it's all the same. Pro wrestling and MMA is the same thing ultimately. Like, I know we've come full circle on this, but I'm convinced.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me think of things like you hear stories about, like, back in WCW, even like William Regal being booked to be squashed by Goldberg and just not wanting to do it and just being like, well, I'll still lose, but I'm going to make it a fight for longer. And like, you can't stop him if he doesn't want to go along with you. That's going to be the match now.
Regal will still put you over, but he's gonna dictate like the style of the match.
And how you get put over.
And that isn't what the story of the match was, but it is now because that's what he's doing and that's how it works. Like, you've still got to do it. It's such a deep vein of metaphor in pro wrestling, but like, you know, like it can analogize so many different things, but also it's such a unique thing in and of itself. Again, it's all just dialectics. There's particularity, there's universality.
It's something that I almost wish that a lot of MMA would kind of just come to realize and admit about itself, is that it's just pro wrestling of a different form. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to book things to be more exciting or trying to find ways to tell stories that get your audience engaged.
Yeah, because like it's so apparent. Like, you know, all everyone ever talks about these days in combat sports is how the most popular thing in combat sports are the Paul brothers, like, and or just, you know, whatever other random YouTubers. Like that's all anyone's talking about. And at the end of the day, all that's doing is like, it's just the same as like old school exhibition matches in Pride, where it's like, well, here's a dude that's really good at this, and here's a dude you want to see.
I also think that kind of connects to this thing of like, you know, I love watching people who have the best skills in the world compete, and I love that aspect of it. But also, you need something to make people emotionally invested in your like competitive format to like want to see it. Just being the best sometimes isn't enough, especially if you're the best through constantly getting decisions. You'll see people just kind of die away from that.
God, this is so funny because do you know about, you know, Jake Hager? Yeah. Fucking his whole like gimmick in wrestling is that he's an undefeated MMA fighter, and all his MMA fights are like fucking ringers, and he still manages to like either barely win or like just disqualifies himself. Like he'll like, it'll even look like he's on top and like could win, and he'll still just knee the other guy in the balls and get himself disqualified, so they can still just be like, well, I'm undefeated, you know. You know what
it's not a loss.
I'm an undefeated MMA fighter. I have a perfect record. I've won every match that has went to a finish.
I believe his last opponent, when they had a fight for him in Bellator, it was like an amateur fighter who was working full-time in a factory came in to fight Jake Hager.
He hasn't had like a legit opponent at all in Bellator from what I've seen, but is like, you know, typical cocky, like asking for the biggest fight whenever one comes up. It's being like, oh, that fight's my fight. I know it's my fight. And it's like, why? Because you're a rich white guy and you get what you want.
Essentially.
Yeah, like, and that's all it is. The only reason he's put in that position is because there's already enough stock behind his name. He's already got the rub from Vince McMahon, like, and that's why he's there.
He's got enough people behind him.
Yeah, like it's purely just he was a high school wrestler. He was a good wrestler, I think, like at a, you know, but JR really fell in love with him. JR got him into the WWE. He made friends with Jericho. That's the rest of his career is like, it's only based on the fact that he did it, like he got there, so now he gets to stay there. Like he's not good. No one likes Jake Hager.
There's not a lot of Jake Hager fans. There's not a lot of Jake Hager t-shirts being sold.
Not at all. They gave him a shitty worked MMA rules fight on Dynamite against this guy called Wardlow, who fucking rules. And like Wardlow looked like the better cage fighter. You know, even though he did like a ridiculous cartoon like Superman punch off the leaping off the cage wall, you know, like, because it's pro wrestling, of course he did.
Gotta put a Showtime punch in there.
Yeah, but you know, he still, like, Jake Hager just looked like shit. He just doesn't look good.
Yeah, he looks like someone who's phoning it in because he knows, like, I'm just gonna do this for forever and they're never gonna get rid of me. So
yeah, it feels like someone, like, he really is the ultimate like peaked in high school of like, you know, he peaked in high school on his wrestling team. He got scouted, and then he was just forever known as the shooter, and has like gone on that reputation without ever improving.
Right. I mean, watching like old Ken Shamrock pro wrestling is better than watching Jake Hager.
Oh, absolutely. I've not seen many Ken Shamrock matches, but the ones I have seen, leaps and bounds, no comparison. It's loads of all those old shooters were like, that's the thing, like they weren't just shooters. Like they knew the entertainment aspect of pro wrestling. They knew they were there to put on the show regardless of whether they were trying to win. Like, fucking Takayama Fry doesn't happen between men who are trying to win a match. It happens between men who are like just trying to show off like how much they can do. Like, it's like, no, I'm not just here as like a matter of pride as a man who's like doesn't want to be the one to lose, which might be like the story that is told about this. Like, this isn't like a man-to-man showdown. This is like no, we are performers in the ring together, and think about how fucking good this is gonna look. Like, regardless of whether that's what they're actually thinking, you can't tell me there's no element of them that's thinking that in this match where they run at each other and just punch each other in sync in the head 20 times.
That's literally a pro wrestling spot. Like, that's a thing people do.
It's literally a pro wrestling spot. And also, they then like recreated the whole thing for a film. Like, it's. And they also recreated it in a pro wrestling match, I think, later.
I believe so.
Yeah, like, and so many different like pro wrestlers have then just stole the spot, obviously, like in homage, like, because of course they have. Like, it's pro wrestling. It doesn't matter if it's a shoot fight or not. It's pro wrestling.
Something I'm thinking about now is almost like kind of related to how companies, specifically when I think about companies that don't want to admit that MMA is pro wrestling, and I think of the UFC, and I think another way you see that come through is the control over what fighters can wear, the fighter kit things, like all of that. I think it also leads to just less of an in for more queer and other minority like groups, because when you control what people can wear, you control how much of the self-expression they're allowed to have.
Yeah, whether that's like a cultural expression or a gender expression.
Right, or just any sort of personal aesthetic, it completely takes away from that. And I think that that's one of the things it's incredibly important to queer culture, to be able to have your personal aesthetic and your style and all of that about you. And when you take that away from people, it flattens everything.
Yeah, and MMA seems to like explicitly try to strip people down, like not just literally of like having them wear the least amount of clothes possible, but also, unless some sponsorship deal has been worked out, those clothes are also going to be as plain as possible. They're going to be black or gray, or like
right, like a little bit of color, or like what they did for Pride Month, where they were like, there can be like hints of rainbow in the details, but like it still has to all be black or whatever.
It's the same as any uniform. Like, it gets the job done, and the job is, well, we all have to perform under these same conditions. And why that is, you can make arguments for each of it. Like, you can make arguments for, oh, well, everyone needs to have the same equipment, everyone needs to just to be on a level playing field. But it's like, okay, but how much do aesthetics come into that? Like, why is the aesthetic angle being policed as well? Like, is that just because they want control of the sponsorships and they want to be in control of your money? Or is it like because, we just don't want any of that faggot shit on TV? Like,
Yeah.
Like there's reasons, and there's usually multiple reasons, but I'm not saying they wear black in MMA because of homophobia, but
but it's part of it. Yeah, because I think that's the thing too, is like, a lot of it probably is mostly motivated by wanting sponsorships and to be in control of how much money you get and who has the deal and all of that. But I'm sure there's also been studies done in other workplaces where you'll see that if you take away that sort of self-expression and you give all of your workers a uniform that is the exact same, you take away some of that personhood and you make everyone feel a little bit more like an automaton. You make it seem like if everyone is the same, you can't tell everyone apart. You just kind of take out the humanity of your workforce. and that has psychological repercussions for your workers and for people who are viewing your product.
I guess that's the thing, is like, they can always put it behind, well, we have this image that we want, and I guess that's it. It's like, what is the image like that they're trying to show us? And it's ultimately it's usually basically just boxing. They want to show us boxing, but then some fucking pesky fuckers try and wrestle out there and make it boring.
But even then, like, pro boxers are allowed to wear like robes and their own colored shorts.
They get to indulge in the pageantry because it's like, because that strain of the business, that part of the combat sports wider industry understands that the pageantry puts people in seats. Like, people, most boxers don't start out wearing silk robes. Like, they let themselves work up to that. They let people feel like they've earned the right to dress up, and then once they've dressed up, like, they get reactions based on how they dress, which is like a combination of, oh, this person I love looks great right now, or this person I hate looks fucking arrogant and rich, or whatever. People say a lot about themselves with how they dress and how they present themselves, especially when you're literally on a huge stage in front of giant crowds. Like, and to remove that element, I think is only serves intentionally removing any like theatrical control. But also, like, they're willing to let it happen in certain circumstances. Like, I haven't seen much of Tom Lawler's MMA career, but it's my understanding that he used to like come out in silly costumes and shit like that just to like pop himself. Like, and they probably let him get away with that, even though it was technically against the rules, because people like to watch it. And it's like, okay, so why is that exception being made? The exception's being made because it's probably making you some money, and that.
Well, and like, we've even heard Dana White complain before about like Israel Adesanya doing dances and stuff on his way out. Like, he talks about, how he doesn't want that to be part of it or whatever, but like, that's part of Izzy's appeal, is that he is someone that has this like more entertainment feminine side to like his persona, and the fact that even one of their main stars doing that is so annoying for Dana that he talks constantly about wanting to shut it down is pretty telling.
Because like, to him, it like, fighting is about masculinity. Like, even if you're a woman, fighting is about masculinity, because that's what men do. Like, which is why, it's different when a trans woman fights than a cis woman, because like, when a cis woman is doing a manly thing, that's that's interesting. When a trans woman is doing a manly thing,
that's threatening now.
Yeah. Like, it's because the violence is associated with masculinity, is like, well, then everything around the violence also has to associate with that same ideal of masculinity. And like, what is Dana White's ideal of masculinity?
It can't be good.
It can't be good. It can't be good. I don't want anything to do with it.
No, and like, that's sort of a similar thing where, you'll see queer cis women being allowed into MMA, but it's specifically butch lesbians that they want to showcase, like, because it has that manly aspect. You won't see a lot of like highly femme like lesbians involved, and that's not because there aren't people like that who are interested in the sport, but it's because that image gets controlled in such a way.
Or like, the butchness isn't as like noticeable to the cis gays in a sports context, where like where traits that are usually taught, like traits that were usually taught to associate with masculinity in women, are instead associated with athleticism. And it's like, oh well, you're not butch, you're just an athlete, you're just a fighter. Like, it's not seen as part of like a queer identity expression. It's seen as like, oh well, you're just one of those manly broads, aren't you? Like,
you're just wearing the pants in your relationship or whatever. That's one of the things too that I think kind of has more flexibility with pro wrestling and stuff, is like you were saying, like, you're trying to figure out how to kind of make your own contributions to the scene and make more queer, like, shoot style pro wrestling popular in the UK and things like that. And I think almost like a similar thing almost needs to happen with MMA, where we need to be able to have like queer run and queer centric promotions. But since we don't have that community in the fan base right now, we don't have anyone to start it. No one has the means or the know-how to kind of run a promotion yet, though it is also queer. And I would like to see that happen eventually. Like, you know, if they're not going to let trans women fight in popular promotions, we might as well just start a trans-only promotion.
Yeah, I mean, why fucking not? We can, you know, since the beginning, since trans people have been like othered, like trans people have carved out their own space. Like, you know,
Had to do it for everything else.
yeah, exactly. Never mind Pride in the 90s. Let's talk about Pride in the 70s.
The original Pride FC.
Pride OG.
Perfect. I'm gonna start merchandising this. That's
God.
I'm only allowed to say funny things if it somehow comes back to like a financial gain, because that's capitalism.
Yeah, that's capitalism.
Mhm.
I mean, that's capitalism. That's podcasting. That's pro wrestling. That's MMA. Everything under capitalism is corrupted by it. That's how it works. None of us are free from sin.
None of us are free from uploading designs to Redbubble.
Fuck, you got me. You got me. You got me.
That's going in.
I've still got like a Redbubble design that's like a fucking Splinter Cell themed T-shirt that I designed for a cracked video game T-shirt contest. Didn't win the contest, so I put it up on Redbubble, and every few years I'll get like $10 out of the blue and be like, "Oh, someone bought that design."
Oh, it's really funny that you mentioned Cracked, because that was actually like when I was about to start college, I'd been reading a bunch of Cracked articles all the time in my free time, and then like just kept spamming their email with like freelance like offers, being like, "Hey, do you want this? Do you want me to write an article about this?"
Yeah, I never like got the confidence to really pitch anything, but like I thought about it all the time because all I did was read their fucking website, because it was like, oh, this has silly bullshit on, but also has so much interesting little trivia that I've just like never heard before, and it's usually like actually sourced and linked and stuff like that. Like, but you know, also you got some dodgy stuff on there sometimes, but you know, it's the internet.
Yeah. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Cry?
Cry, yeah. I mean, eventually I think I just got burned out on listicles.
Yeah, I think that like, because I started reading Cracked, and then like BuzzFeed got popular, and then like I just got so many sent to me or so many linked, and it's like I can't do this anymore.
Cracked got BuzzFeedified.
Yeah. BuzzFed.
The forced BuzzFeedification of Cracked.com.
Oh, that's my dissertation I'm writing.
God. Yeah. We can just do a thing where if we run out of, if we like hit a bump in the conversation where it's like, so what are we talking about? I can just read a poem if you want. I've got this poetry book in front of me. I can.
Do you read a poem? We might not put it on the episode, but it might be a Patreon exclusive.
There we go.
Get to hear some poetry.
Okay. So this one is called "For Adorable Adrian Adonis, Unable to Wash the Pink from His Hands." Hey AD, which way's the wind blowing today, brother? Have you taken a walk on the wild side in a while? Hulk Hogan, 1986.
I think that's like a big part of how it kind of has spread more into pro wrestling and stuff, is just by having those depictions of more like queer coded people for certain heels or performers throughout time. Whether the actual wrestler is queer or not, it kind of seeps into the consciousness. And
yeah, which historically they usually weren't.
Right, yeah. There are probably so many people that, you know, it could have been a thing of being closeted even as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing with, you know, sexuality and like being closeted and shit like that. It's like, well, how do you even know? You know, like how do you even know that you aren't? Like until you hit the moment where you realize, like, how do you actually know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I think about that a lot with like my own transness and stuff. Is like I had known about gay people and things like that for a long time as a teenager, but the like ability to be trans was not something that was like anything I had encountered until I was already about like 18, 19.
Yeah, same. I literally saw the word transgender for the first time at 16 and had to ask someone what it meant. I was like, it was like, oh, is that like transsexual? Like, because that was the word I knew, and
Right.
and they were like, oh, well, it's like that, but it's for gender instead of sex, and I was like, what? And that's how I found out that gender was supposed to be something that I was experiencing and not something that I'd completely shut myself out from, you know. So like, so then I was like, oh, I guess I'm genderless. I'm like, well, then that was the beginning of a long journey. But like, it was literally within like 2 weeks of seeing the word, I was like comfortably identifying as non-binary. Like sometimes you just need like, so you don't know what you don't have like until you've got it. It's like the opposite of you don't know what you've got till it's gone. It's like no, you don't know what you're missing until you have it.
Yeah. You don't know what you're missing until you like just stumble upon a whole part of the world that you didn't even know was there.
And I think like, sometimes when I think about when I was liked wrestling as a kid, I'm a bit bitter about it because I think like, oh well, I was basically bullied out of liking it by my family. But at the same time, I can't say I fucking blame them because already at that age, like I was definitely being taught like a lot of shit that I didn't couldn't process as being inappropriate lessons for a kid to learn. Like you know famously, when I was like 6 years old, my mum, like, I got in trouble because me and my friends were playing wrestling in our bedroom. It was like me, my cousin, and our mate who was the same age. And like for us, playing wrestling involved like wrestling teddies and shit like that. Like but then because of us mostly keeping up with wrestling through the video games, those also included like sex storylines and shit like that. So like after we wrestled the teddies, we would then be like pretending the teddies were divas, and and we were a bit too loud the first time that happened, and got caught, and that was something I had to face, was that my mom just caught us pretending to have sex with some toys, like because like that was part of the fantasy that was being sold. Like it was that like, oh, these are hyper masculine visions of what you could be, and that you can't just you don't just like be the biggest strongest person who beats everyone up. You also like fuck whatever woman you want, because that's part of that. Like,
yeah, being like sexually dominating is part of being masculine and all of that. And
the women basically only exist as objects for you to have sex with when you want to.
Right, yeah.
And like that was all in there, but like I just saw a fun game, you know what I mean? So like, so like in contrast to like I can see that shit in retrospect of like how it like wrestling fandom could have been negatively affecting me. Like coming back to it as a queer trans adult, it's like wrestling has done so much for how I understand my own sexuality, my own gender, my own body. Like getting back into wrestling as an adult and getting into like these fan communities of like other queer people especially, and like making new friendships that involve a lot of like our specific perspective on pro wrestling, and us talking about it in that way is like, no, yeah, this is done more for me than I could say in like the exact opposite way. Like it's helped me learn about myself. It's helped me open myself up to new things. It's helped me gain confidence in areas of my identity I was less confident about for various reasons. Like, and that's because of the people more than it is because of the wrestling. So like, yeah, I think it's always just about it's always about the relationships you form. I feel like even in fandom, I feel like a lot of what I get out of something that I'm enjoying is who am I enjoying it with. Like if it's something that I'm enjoying alone, then like that is probably going to change how I engage with it. And I think, yeah, so like when you like when we have queer fan communities, I think and this, you know, like that is able, you're able then to like, the queer professionals are able to thrive more because there's like a fan base waiting for them, you know what I mean, like rapidly waiting for them, as well as, you know, like let's not forget that like all these queer wrestlers and all these people of color and all these like queer wrestlers of color who are like fucking killing the scene right now and are dominating, like they're not just killing the scene with other people of color and with other queer people, they're killing the scene with everyone. Like everyone loves these people, everyone wants to book these people, and it's because they're the best. Like I think that's another part of it, is just like so many people involved who are queer or, you know, whatever other, because there, you know, there are obviously a lot of times where people are like, well, here's us campaigning or doing a show that's just for women or just for black people or just for whatever, because of how they've historically been overlooked, you know, whatever category. It's like, well, no, these people are also just the best. Like, and you have to deal with that. Like and you know, the meritocracy has never been a real thing and never will be a real thing. But also that line of who gets to flourish is like a little bit more blurred when the entertainment side is like such a foundational aspect of it, because it's like you can never win a match, you can lose every one of your matches and be the most over person in a company. Like, you know, that's like the foundational booking for a lot of people, is like, oh well, this guy's gonna be our ace, okay, let's put him in a 2-year losing streak so that everyone will love it when he comes out of it. Like,
yeah, when he starts going on a winning streak, it's going to be the biggest pop we get, because we've set up that expectation of this person's only going to lose.
Yeah, and we get to have them be in all these amazing matches against foes of like higher and higher caliber. So even though they're never winning, they're getting closer every time against people who are even harder to beat. So like, you know, the people who beat them yesterday, would they beat them tomorrow, sort of thing. Like, yeah. And so like I feel, yeah, there's that, like, sorry, I don't know why I just went into like narrative crafting. I think that's just when I speak about pro wrestling, it's really hard for me to not go on segues, because so much of it just is fluid and like goes into like the way you talk about one thing goes into the way you talk about another, which goes into the way you talk about another. And it's, you know, God, I just fucking love it. I just love this. I love this so much.
Well, and like a way that sort of narrative storytelling ties into like MMA is some of the biggest stars the UFC has right now are people that aren't coming up like Conor McGregor or whatever through, you know, their mic skills and being like a big draw for people that way. It's people that are both like Charles Oliveira and Dustin Poirier both. They had a sort of career where they've been here a long time. They came in really young. They were hot prospects, but then they've had losses. They've had knocks on their records where people weren't sure if they were going to recover. And then they finally made their way to being champions and being like bigger names. And you get that sort of organic like fan base behind you, and people can watch you grow and develop.
Mm. But that's the thing though as well, is like a lot of the time that organic fan base like isn't organic in the sense of like it's grew on its own. It's organic in the sense of like it's grew in resistance to what is actually being like, you know, it's in resistance to the hand that's guiding the whole thing. Like these people have like in a way of like in a story crafting perspective, in a promotional perspective, you know, they've probably been left out to roost too long. Like they could have had their time earlier. They could have had a stronger prime earlier that they will never get again, because like just the promoters didn't want them in that spot yet. And now they've managed to get in that spot anyway. Like when people may argue that they're past the prime, like they've still managed to get there. And it's like, God, think about how good they could have been if they were given opportunities they deserved. But it's never about who deserves it. It's about what sells.
Yeah. Like, that makes me think, like, almost like there's been years there where Vince McMahon was just trying to get everyone to swallow the pill that was Roman Reigns being the top guy in the promotion. And then after all of that, we see the Kofi Kingston title reign where everyone loved it so much because he'd been there for so long and they'd wanted to see him be this bigger star. And then they cut it out very quick because it wasn't what Vince wanted.
Yeah, it was. Oh God, that was the thing as well. Was like that was very much the all the fan fervor behind Kofi was very much a personal. People love Kofi specifically. People love the New Day specifically. But then, of course, also there was the racial and political element to it, which was part of the story being told. Like they couldn't say it explicitly because what the story was is WWE is racist,
Right.
and like that is the truth of it. But like but then the people who were racist to you tell you to work with you to tell the story about them being racist. You know what I mean? Like, and you don't really have anywhere else to go to tell that story, even if there's arguably, whether you want to argue about whether they're a competitor or not. AEW exists now, which can only be good for the wrestling scene as a whole, is that there's more options available to workers. But at the same time, it's like Vince McMahon's still in charge. Like he's like showing you how far we've come by being the racist villain, but like that's a role he's playing while he's still in charge of the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're being told this, like you're telling this story about you overcoming your oppression while still being reined in by your oppressor because they control the narrative.
Yeah, it was so like disappointing how that like reign ended as well, because of the momentum it had, and like it ended in the most anticlimactic way. And it's hard for that to happen and for it not to feel designed that way, because it was designed that way. It was booked. Someone booked it. That's how it works.
Yeah, it's someone's job to detail how this is going to happen and when it's going to happen and how long it's going to last. So someone had the job of saying, well, you're just going to get squashed eventually.
And when you're the wrestler who's been there for years, you know that your job is to do the best with what you're given, because they give you things you can't change. And if you want to keep your job, you have to do what they say. Like, ugh.
Awesome. It's been lovely speaking with you, AJ. And go ahead and plug anything you want to plug, your podcast or your Twitter or whatever.
Okay, yeah. So as I said earlier, it's my podcast is called 2x2. You can find us on Twitter at 2x2cast. You can find my personal account at More Guillotines. What else? Oh yeah, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/2x2. We do like watch-alongs for all the matches we watched that we cover in our episodes. We also record ourselves watching along with them for if you want to experience the match that way. Been told that's a fun way to watch it. We also do like bonus shows on there and things like that. And we do a show called Not Paid by the Hour, after the old wrestling cliche, which is basically our outtakes show. But it's like outtakes and bonus content, because it's like, okay, we cut this from the podcast, let's just throw it in Not Paid by the Hour, so it's getting used. But it's also like, hey, we were just hanging out and decided to turn our mics on, so it's just a conversation, not about wrestling for once, but we've made it content. And yeah, that all used to be set out, so like different tiers got different things, but we decided that like we wanted anyone who supports us to like have access to all our stuff. So anything from $1 upwards, you'll have access to everything we do.
Awesome. Thank you all for listening to Pride Never Die. You can check us out on Instagram. My Instagram is PowerTool, PWRTOOLE. It's the same thing on Twitter. And then check us out at Patreon too. Without your support, we can't really keep doing what we're doing. And we try to be the premier place to come for leftist, queer-centric, people of color and indigenous focused combat sports and political. We do everything at this point.
Kind of have to.
Yeah, you have to once you get going. But yeah, thank you very much, and please support AJ. Support everything she's doing. It's the same thing. We can't keep taking the space we're doing if we don't get support. It means everything to us.
Thank you so much.